Good evening, friends. Welcome home to most of you. Some of you, this is your home always, and you feel like you never leave, so welcome home anyway. My name is Dawn Jordan, and it's my pleasure to serve as Dean of the School of Architecture, Planning, and Preservation. And it is a real pleasure to introduce and welcome you to the inaugural Karl F.G. Dupuy Lecture on Urban Design. We've been waiting a long time to do this. This new lecture series is named in honor of Professor Emeritus Karl Dupuy, who inculcated generations of University of Maryland students with a deep appreciation for urban form and the responsibility to architects to create and maintain humane and sustainable urban environments. To colleagues, students, and friends, Karl was a force of nature within the architecture program at the University of Maryland, and it's already been fun to hear you share your stories and imitations. His passion for urbanism, architectural history, and building craft was foundational as a part of the curriculum. He led a number of urban design studios, many of you were a part of for more than 40 years, but was best known for his class Architecture 654, Urban Development and Design Theory, which generations of architects took with him and continue to take with us. As a teacher, Karl was a confident mentor and feisty curmudgeon, I didn't choose those words, and shepherd. He was fiercely dedicated to teaching and was gracious with his time and spirit. He was renowned for his biting wit and hard truths and had a terrific sense of humor, fairness, and kindness. He guided legions of students through their theses, counseling them on urban form and future career paths, and was unreserved in his pride in their accomplishments. Dupuy kept in touch with many of his students over the years. Upon news of his passing, pages of tributes flooded social media from hundreds because he had profoundly touched their lives as teacher, mentor, and friend. When Karl passed away a couple of years ago, his family sought an appropriate way to honor and celebrate his memory here at the school. The idea of an annual lecture focused on urban design theory quickly gained traction, and his family decided to endow a lecture series on this topic in his honor. Many University of Maryland alumni have also gathered and contributed generously to this fund. I want to encourage as many of you as possible to think about doing the same in the future. If you have questions to do this, please feel free to reach out to me or my colleague, Leah Livingston, there in the red. Leah and I are happy to introduce you to opportunities to join us so that we can continue this tribute in the way and the manner we start tonight. Importantly, I do want to recognize the Dupuy family for their incredible generosity ensuring the legacy of Karl here in the school. I would like to have the Dupuy family stand and be recognized. We are so proud to have you here with us tonight. I believe that Rick, Karl's son, would like to come up and say a few words, so please join me.
Thank you. Well, isn't this a pretty sight? Good evening, I'm Rick Dupuy, one of Professor Dupuy's two children, along with my brother Paul and my mother Peg Kepner. I'm glad to be here at the School of Architecture, Planning, and Preservation for the inaugural Karl F.G. Dupuy Lecture in Urban Design. My father loved cities in all their organized chaos, and he loved his colleagues and students here at Maryland Also a sort of organized chaos, I suppose. So it's very appropriate to remember him in this way, which combines two of his great loves. Some of my earliest memories are of visiting the architecture school with my father. I remember playing on the map of Manhattan on the floor of the great space, browsing for hours in the library while Dad made his studio rounds, and visiting Mrs. Alley in the slide library, where I later worked my first teenage job. But although I've always known my dad as a professor of architecture, he only wound up here fortuitously, as he put it in a brief essay about his life, which he wrote for his 50th college reunion a few years ago. He attended architecture school at the impromptu suggestion of one of his undergraduate professors, and a decade or so later, after a career as an urban designer for the city of New York, he applied more or less in the spur of the moment to teach at this then fledgling architecture school. But the seeds of his interest in teaching went back further. While at graduate school, Dad won a traveling fellowship, which in retrospect he viewed as a turning point in his life. It yielded, he wrote in that same reunion essay, quote, 4 months of intense travel in and around Europe, studying architecture and experiencing cities, landscapes, and cultures. This trip convinced me that I wanted not only to practice architecture, but also to share my observations with others. Similarly, he wrote that another long overseas trip a decade later, quote, piqued my interest in teaching and confirmed that there is no substitute for firsthand experience when building a catalog of precedents for teaching urbanism and architecture. In short, as many of you know, my father wasn't primarily an architect of the textbook or the lecture podium or the drafting board or even the slide projector. He was one of shoe leather. He loved to get out into the world and see things with his own eyes, and as his son, I often got to tag along with him. I unfortunately can't recall anything of his famous sabbatical year examining urban form in India since I was 2. Just think, my father and mother took a 2-year-old to India for a year. But I remember visiting the castles and new towns of King Edward in North Wales, the Bastides of Aquitaine, and the fan-shaped Schlosspark in the aptly named city of Karlsruhe. I remember climbing the Iron Age hill fort at Maiden Castle, and then debating the pros and cons of Prince Charles, or I suppose King Charles, along with Leon Creer, their pet project at Poundbury nearby. And I remember taking time in Edinburgh to pace out the widths of the alleyways of James Craig's Newtown of 1766. But of course, my brother Paul and I weren't the only ones who got to tag along. Generations of students enjoyed the same forced marches. Something I was lucky enough to see firsthand as my father's gopher on a few of the many student trips he led, or when visiting him during one of his many semesters abroad at his beloved Kipling Hall. Like many other professors, he said it was his students who kept him young, and that thanks to their fresh eyes, he saw new things every trip. My father concluded that 50th reunion essay by reporting that my brother Paul once asked him why he spent all his time teaching and administering Maryland's architecture program instead of working in a firm and designing buildings. I responded, he wrote, by showing him a number of fine buildings, all of which happened to have been designed by my former students. That is my legacy. I taught them well. I'm very proud of my students. They no longer surprise me with their efforts. They continue to produce wonderful reflections of their education. My family and I look forward to this lecture becoming a tradition, providing useful urban enrichment to future generations of students. We want to convey our thanks to everybody here at the school, particularly Ralph Bennett and Lindley Van, my father's emeritus office mates, Brian Kelly, who helped conceive this lecture series, and Leah Livingston, who facilitated the plans, all the donors who helped to endow it, Elizabeth Plater-Zyberk for visiting us to give this inaugural lecture, and most of all of you who are joining us today. So thank you all very much. Enjoy the lecture. And as my father used to say, I feel more like I do now than I did when I came in.
Thank you for that. And I know many of you are sitting being flooded with memories today. So I hope you'll hold those in your heart and bring them to us when we talk after the session today. I want to thank our guests for joining us tonight. Tonight we have the pleasure of welcoming Elizabeth Plater-Zyberk, former dean at the University of Miami School of Architecture and co-founder of DPZ Co-Design, along with her partner Andreas Duwani. This power couple refocused urban discourse and practice in the United States and globally with the co-founding of the Congress for New Urbanism. Actually, it is one of your early books that brought me to the Academy myself, so I'm a bit of a fangirl. Born in Pennsylvania, educated at Princeton and Yale School of Architecture, Professor Plater-Zyberk has kept one foot in the academy and one foot in practice for much of her professional career. She's currently the Malcolm Matheson Distinguished Professor of Architecture and Director of the Master of Urban Design program. From 1995 to 2013, she served as Dean of the School of Architecture at the University of Miami in Coral Gables, Florida. Our moderator, you know well tonight. He has a reputation of his own for greatness. Professor Brian Kelly serves as Associate Dean. He serves as Associate Dean for Development and Faculty Affairs here at the School of Architecture, Planning and Preservation. He's beloved for a lot of reasons, including the wickedly wonderful tours of Italy and other spaces that he takes us and our students on. He has a lot of fans in this room. He is a pioneer in the architecture program, a teacher, a well-respected designer, and a generous benefactor who makes study abroad possible for so many of our students. For more than 3 decades, Professor Kelly has shaped our community and generations of graduates, and he is co-hosting the conversation tonight. So I'm happy to welcome our guests, Professor Kelly and Professor Plater-Zyberk. Thank you.
Okay. Listen up. Before the urban train leaves the station, a little bit of housekeeping here. So just to let you guys know, Liz and I have been talking about this since last June. This is a highly scripted event. We know every single word that's going to happen here. We started a conversation last June. I was in Florence, and Liz was in France. And we ignored all of Florence and France just to have this conversation and set up what we were going to talk about tonight. So the ground rules are simply this, is that Liz is going to start off with a little overview of her work as an architect, as an educator, as a reformer of how we think about urbanism. And then what we're going to do is to sit down together in a conversation for about 45 minutes or so. So that means no questions from you. I'll be drilling Liz back and forth. And at the end of that, then we'll open up the floor to questions. And since there's a simulcast going on YouTube, Facebook, all those kind of things, what's going to be very important is that when you ask a question, I'm going to do the Phil Donahue thing. I'm going to jump over the rows of the folks in the front row here, pass the microphone back, and you got to give, I don't care, Matt, how loud your voice is, you have to ask the question in the microphone so the folks at home can hear you. And that's basically what we're going to do. So Liz, it's all yours if you want to get up and go to the podium and take it away.
Good evening, everyone. Is the microphone on?
Yes.
Yes, okay, very good. Thank you. Thank you, Brian, Dawn, and Rick. Rick is a hard act to follow. I am honored to have been invited to start this lecture series. I remember Karl as at the school here, as this school gave me my first teaching job many years ago, and Karl Dupuy was among the welcoming faculty for a young person coming just out of grad school. I'm delighted to see others from that time, faculty that I enjoyed being with. Thank you for whatever that was. And I've long admired Maryland's faculty and your success in introducing students to the professions. Many among your students, we have been pleased to welcome to Miami for graduate degrees. It might be said that much of what we will cover this evening can be traced, a kind of intellectual genealogy, to your library and a librarian named Verna Neal, who had the special collection that included the American Vitruvius Civic Art by Hegeman and Peets, published in 1922, never signed out of the library until my colleague Pat Pinnell, around 77 or 78, found it and alerted us to its delights. And I would say it's one of the foundational texts of the new urbanism. So thank you for that. And thank you for introducing me to teaching. The slides that I will show represent a shared trajectory among many colleagues of a special time. I'm at the age when I'm looking back. It seems like we've had a benign moment, a generation, in fact, of maybe 30 years or so, in which a time that enabled people and places to come together in an unusual way to try to make the built environment a better place for communities and individuals, to make the cities and the urbanism that we've been speaking about greater than the sum of its parts. And I think that it behooves us to look back at it, because the immediate history, this may be a statement for the students, the immediate history of your faculty and what they experienced isn't always evident to you. And there is a kind of continuity, but it's not yet in the literature. Maybe it hasn't been coalesced into a story. And so this is a kind of elementary story of what we've been through, privileged to go through. So, I mentioned that it's about a generation, 30 or 40 years. And this is a reflection of my personal experience. I'll be showing you projects that I've worked on, but also many endeavors and what I think are achievements related to urban design, which many people have participated in, including some of your graduates who are sitting here and others, many of you in the audience. And so I'm not going to read everything that's on these slides, don't worry. But it's interesting to make this kind of list and say, what happened during these years? What were the steps that we went through? What were the influences? What were the benchmarks? What were the stair steps that raised us up, including the forming of organizations? And as I was putting this together, I realized I've left out things like tactical urbanism, but this could be a much longer list. It wouldn't fit on the screen. I mentioned civic art. This is the frontispiece of the historical book. It was reprinted later, probably in the 80s during our time. But another significant text, influential text of that time, was the Anglo-American Suburb, which Bob Stern and John Massingale put together. A little issue of AD that pointed us towards the prior generation of community design that actually many of us were familiar to with individual places like Coral Gables, where I live and where the University of Miami is. This has now become Paradise Planned, which is a tome, probably many of you know. It weighs about almost 10 pounds, I think. And then at the same time, as these books were influencing design, there were people like Dira Tadani and Catholic University, Peter Hetzel, who were actually making these ideas visible in a way that projected their ability to go forward. There were drawings as well as models. I think at that time, many of us in the room will acknowledge that we came out of architecture school not knowing very much about urban design or cities. We may have had one course with someone like Christopher Tunnard. And we were beginning to discover that actually in that period, that the Anglo-American suburb was referring to, and that we were admiring in the cities that we were living in, that there actually had been some theory about making neighborhoods and communities. In 1980, when we did our first traditional urbanism conventional suburban sprawl diagram, we had no idea about the 1930s neighborhood design. And then the new urbanists took that on and began to make it their own. And you can see the 5-minute walk of the pedestrian shed was transferred from the historical into the contemporary. Of course, very early in all of this was the building of Seaside, which many of you may remember received a tremendous amount of publicity. There was no PR agent. It just caught people's fancy. And a number, practically when every new building went up, somebody published it. And pretty soon people started living it, coming to it and experiencing it and taking the ideas back home and saying, why can't we do this in Peoria? At the University of Miami, we were beginning to apply this academically, and we started a master's program to focus on urban design. We called it suburb and town design because historically this was about town design, and it was called town planning. But we didn't want to leave out the fact that we were working in the suburbs. And that's Victor Dover sitting in one of the early computers, the early computer imaging, which used cosmetic, the software that cosmetic surgeons were using. We've come a long way since then. But that excitement with technology existed then. So, you know, we might have a discussion about this in terms of the current day. But the urban code for Seaside, we had the kind of ambition that maybe this new technology could help us make it more applicable to other conditions, to broader conditions. And so the traditional neighborhood district or development code was developed, and we thought we could make it three-dimensional. We had lots of ambitions. We didn't understand the limitations of the technology then, so it came out as a grid on a blueprint. Closer to home, the first non-resort or first real alternative to suburban building really occurred here in Kentlands. The idea of a walkable place, of children walking to school, a mix of housing in close proximity, preserving the environment, the natural environment, was all driving a kind of new series of ideas. And of course, later on, maybe we'll talk about this, who the people were who enabled this to happen, like people like Joe Alfondra and the mayor of Kentlands. And one of the drastic changes to the conventions was this juxtaposition of a variety of what we learned were called price points on the same block. If I remember correctly, back then it was 170,000, 220,000, and then around the corner, 495,000. I shuddered to think of what that might be today. The ideas soon were requested to be brought to existing places. This small town in Florida at a time when we were talking about growth management, wise growth, later to become smart growth, and Stewart was one of the first steps in that direction of working with existing communities. Meanwhile, the people who were working on all these things in various cohorts or even independently were talking to each other. And the Iwani principles, which grew out of the California Small Governments Commission, which some of us attended, and as designers we said, this is policy, this isn't good enough, we need design, and for that reason the Congress for the New Urbanism was founded. A few years later, setting out a charter, not unlike our understanding of the historical impact of organizations like CIAM, the Congrès International d'Architecture Moderne. Over the years, I wouldn't say that we were the reason for this or the beginning, but a number of organizations have grown, various interest groups that are supporting people working in design policy and management and enabling this kind of concern for cities and sustainable communities to grow in various kinds of efforts. So while there was this kind of very optimistic move forward, there were a number of events, I think, that enabled further some of this, what I would say is advancement, including a number of catastrophes like Hurricane Andrew and South Dade. When we first brought about 100 people together to look at how to rebuild the area that had been literally flattened and destroyed. And one of the opportunities was to work with Habitat on a kind of ideal neighborhood, which you see here. This is Jordan Commons, which gave a lot of impetus to this idea that you can make lemons out of lemonade in urban situations which may look like dead ends. Even the rebuilding of cities that have been eviscerated, like West Palm Beach. The map shows you growth over 2 decades, the kind of infilling, and a very slow kind of recognition that these places, along with, we might point to Richard, Florida, kind of guiding us theoretically about cities. Preservation has always been an important part of this, a kind of initiative, which then the idea that an existing building might be restored and become the centerpiece for new building. Various tools were being, theories and tools and techniques were being developed by this ever-growing group of people in the new urbanism. And the transect was a very important absorption of environmental and ecological ideas. At some point, we began to understand that cities don't exist in isolation of their natural environment, and so how that might, structure of the natural environment might inform the structure of the city came out through the transect. The thinking and the application to cities produced, and following on codes like the T&D, produced the idea that there could be a generative code for bringing all these principles of the natural environment and the built environment, communities, even economics, into play in a generative document. So at some point, also in Florida, and this had a lot to do with the fact that Seaside was on the coast, the Gulf Coast of Florida, an opportunity came up. This is following a very severe recession. I think it has a particular name now. These things are identified just like hurricanes, but I don't remember what this one was called. But there was an opportunity for the government to buy a very large property from one of the banks as one of those underwater assets, no pun intended. And the people who developed Seaside, Robert Davis, Robert and Darrell, and others in the area started the Conservation and Development Trust to do a plan for this. And the interesting thing about it is it's really at a regional scale. There was an acquisition and disposition component, sell some to make money so you can buy the more sensitive lands that weren't part of the tract. And much of that happened. I think it's probably one of the more successful regional plans in the country, which maybe most people don't really know about it. But part of it was to suggest that any new building that was happening should follow the principles of good neighborhood design, walkability, compactness, mixed uses, and so on. And what emerged were places like Rosemary Beach, also on the coast, and Alice Beach, not far from it. So now there's about half a dozen communities there that follow this pattern. And if you haven't been there, it's pretty remarkable to see them all. And remarkable also because they were being built in the way that cities used to be built, one lot at a time, one builder at a time, one family at a time. So many people really participated in this. It wasn't related. It wasn't linear. Not to denigrate what they do, but it was a kind of unique manner of doing this. Lots of publications. When at the 2008 recession, I think many of us were concerned that this was going to be the end of all of this, much like World War I was, and the Depression ended the other era that we admired. But it turns out that there were many publications going on about the theories, the ideas, and the various tools that were being developed. Sprawl repair, suburban retrofit began to emerge. One of the first largest one was in downtown Kendall in South Miami. Our colleagues Dover Cole worked on this with us, and lo and behold, it began to take form. This is what some of it looks like today. The county government, which didn't want to have any plans drawn, all they wanted was a piece of their zoning code made for this place. And that was really the first form-based code applied to a piece of city. You can see the towers have that peculiar shape because the neighbors didn't want us to go beyond 20 stories, and the developers wanted taller buildings. So the compromise, and it was put in the code, was, okay, you get 5 more stories, but you have to step back. That project, which also required liners of parking garages, then enabled the citywide code, Miami 21, the first citywide form-based code, to be enabled because the liner apartments were so successful in the market that it no longer frightened developers to have things like that required in the code. So there's much more to tell you about this one, and I'll refrain from that, but it enabled places to rebuild in interesting ways like the Miami Design District, which is full of very interesting individual building designs, buildings that light up at night, totally contemporary of their time. And because it's retail, they're already renewing and rebuilding them. A totally contemporary take on a traditional neighborhood in Miami Beach, because of course that is the history of Miami Beach, was to have been largely developed during modernism, but also tracing the idea of the transect. The houses in that aerial on the left look at townhouses, which are not much larger than they are, and then the high-rises face the high-rise beach. Another hurricane, Hurricane Katrina. The CNU came together with 150 people in this case, to work on the 13 towns of Mississippi. There was a lot of attention on New Orleans professionally, and this was a volunteer effort to help the smaller communities that had been destroyed. And much of that work continued with the various groups that worked on it, and probably one of the most famous things that came out of it is the Katrina Cottage, which now is in some places called the tiny house, and is spurring a kind of interest in this kind of housing applied to existing neighborhoods to deal with their housing problems. In Florida, the CNU has continued to be active recording What's going on that 2005 and I think 2015 is when the CNU met there, and these books give you a big history of that. And I recently edited an issue of The Classicist, which speaks to how classical and traditional architecture played a role in the urbanization of Florida. At the university, we think travel is great, just like you do, and both abroad and in the United States. Seaside is very far from where we are, so we don't get there as often as sometimes we get to places like Rome. And we've worked with various communities, both locally, the students and faculty on charrettes, and one kind of major countrywide plan for Haiti after the 2010 earthquake, which was taken to the United Nations to try to get funding for rebuilding. One of the favorite things that we did when I was the dean was that we took one semester, much like we did after Hurricane Andrew, and said, okay, everybody's going to do something about the waterfront in Miami, which has very little public frontage. Most buildings back onto it. And there was an ordinance about making it a public waterfront, but it didn't extend the whole length of it. It didn't address the difficult portions of it. And everybody in all the studios did one piece of it. And then a few faculty put together this booklet, which continues to guide the developers, even though it's not part of anybody's official plan. And that kind of work at the university, the kind of it's not high-level research. It doesn't get huge grants. It's just somebody saying, we need to address this. And so looking at climate change, because I teach an adaptation course, adaptation to climate change, I sat down with the students and we said, what is it that, what can the new urbanism teach us about adapting? We know that we're already dealing with emission control, so to speak, by making walkable, transit-oriented communities. That's one thing you can do, but adaptation, which is so unique according to place, so regionally or even locally specific, what can help us with that? And we lit upon the transect as that kind of understanding of gradations and literally using the ecological transect of the land to understand impacts and responses, which has now become part of the county's climate action plan. This applies to fire and other kinds of conditions as well. And so I end with a projection forward. It's fun to look back and try to pull all these things together, but I must say, as a teacher, I often look at my students and say, we had lots of challenges that we were excited about, discoveries to be made, things to explore, and try to make our world better. And so thinking ahead to what is in front of our students interests me. So I think I'll end there. And
come on over. So Liz, that was great. As you were talking about that wonderful book, Civic Art, still in the library. Nobody can check it out anymore because it's too valuable. So some of the Princeton reprints get checked out. But it's an interesting proposition that we learn a lot of stuff in history theory classes, but a lot of that stuff is very much edited. So in my generation, probably in your generation of being in school, we didn't learn about Nolan or Merrick or the Olmsteds or Tounard, because there was a modernist prejudice to the history that was being taught to us. And so we learned a particular kind of urbanism. And part of this, part of the whole CNU has been part of a discovery of what baby got thrown out with the bathwater, or what baby got thrown out and the bathwater got thrown out at a point in time. But I'm interested in in beginnings. And we talked a little bit about this, and you know that I'm going to ask you this question. So you, along with Andreas, were among the founders of the Miami firm Arquitectonica. And the work of Arquitectonica was inspired by modern architects such as Le Corbusier, Marcel Breuer, Niemeyer, et cetera, other proponents of avant-garde architecture. And it seems a far cry from where you guys ended up with the new urbanism and the kind of architecture you did. So could you help us to sort of understand that part of the story of being fresh out of school, meeting up with some very talented individuals who continue to practice as part of the firm Arquitectonica, and then that arc that took you and Andreas elsewhere?
Good question. But not uncomfortable at all, because I think that was an interesting time. In fact, we might look at it as the time of postmodernism, in which most of us had come out of school with Le Corbusier firmly branded. When we were undergraduates, it was Le Corbusier, Alto, and Mies. Those were the books on the reserve shelf, and a few others only. But there were also people like Kenneth Frampton, who was teaching courses on the history of urban planning. And then in graduate school, it was people like Vincent Scully, who was saying, let's look at American models. We don't need to be looking to Europe for everything. Or Alan Greenberg, who was looking at Lutyens' work and beginning his classical practice. So it was a very diverse and Catholic moment, in a sense, in which many things were possible, or let's say interesting, if not entirely possible. And I think even the Arquitectonica work was interested in the history of modernism in Miami. It was looking at how, there was brutalism in Miami, there were concrete buildings, but there was also modernism in Brazil, and there was modernism in Miami Beach, and there was Morris Lapidus. And so all of this was a kind of part of the DNA of that time. So you really could do many different things, take many different directions.
And to be fair, Arquitectonica was breathing life into modern architecture in South Florida that had become tired and played out in a lot of more corporate and standard solutions of modern architecture up and down the beach and up and down the landbound side of the South Florida coast.
And there was also this, I think from our perspective, we got involved with urbanism beyond individual buildings. Arquitectonica was doing iconic, as they're called, buildings. The form of the building was important. Somehow it needed to be new and different and shocking. That's always true in our profession, right? And we thought it was radical to be thinking about suburbia, because the architecture didn't occur in suburbia. Architects didn't work in suburbia. Even Leo Creer back then said, architects don't design houses. But it was, when I brought civic art into my first studio at the University of Miami, it was to design a suburban subdivision, to work with the students to design a suburban subdivision, using one that was in our office, which when we left Arquitectonica, went with us, which is called Charleston Place. It's in Boca. So I think there was a kind of, as the firm diverged, as the firm split, the understanding of buildings and urbanism as two should be unified, but at that time, separate efforts emerged.
So oftentimes when people talk about CNU or about new urbanism, the idea of new urbanism often gets conflated with the idea of traditional architecture and classicism. But I know that back in the 90s, I remember Matt Bell and myself bumping into you and Andreas. You seem to be having a rather lovely luncheon in Rome, in Trastevere. And you guys called us over and mentioned to us that we needed to go rent a car and drive to the Pontine Marshes, where we would discover a series of new towns that were built in the 1930s. And lo and behold, these towns were all built out of modern architecture, yet they displayed some of the most vibrant traditional urbanism. So tell me, is there a place for modern architecture in the new urbanism? Or does everything have to be definitively traditional? Say, for example, could a contemporary architectonica build in a DPZ planned town?
Well, they build in old urbanism, so yes, certainly. And I think that's a fair question, because for years, one of the critiques of the new urbanism and of urban design in general, I think, was that it was somehow backward to be thinking in terms of traditional form. Less so traditional urban form, but certainly buildings. But I think one thing that's important to understand about the period in which it was emerging was the fact that housing in the US was largely of traditional form. The market felt comfortable with the colonial house in Kentlands. The first houses of Kentlands were the suburban houses that people were accustomed to already. It's just the garage was turned around and put in the backyard to be entered from the alley, and the house got closer to the street. And so the urbanism was the area where you could proffer change, because people really didn't understand it that well. But the buildings would have been hard. In fact, when we did Charleston Place, which was referring to Charleston as a southern urban and building type, the subdivision next door had 3 architectonica model houses on it, which were like their buildings, colorful, spiky, unusual in form. And it never got off the ground because it was culturally too distant from what people were accustomed to. That's changed in a big way. Maybe Dwell had a lot to do with it. And I think there's much less reliance, in a sense, on the traditional form to make places that function traditionally.
So over the years, one of the big significant transformations from paper to built reality was Seaside. Other planned communities took place, notably here in nearby in Kentlands. I remember at the start of the CNU in about 1993, it seemed like this was all stuff that was going to be an immense struggle to get done and to get people to buy into. And yet today it seems to be very much de rigueur. Wherever you look, there are people at least trying to toe the line on something that is reminiscent of CNU, if not literally applying principles of CNU. So is it more difficult, or is it easier, or is it about the same to sell plans to get people to buy, but to get people to buy into the principles of a well-planned urban proposition like you and Andreas do in your firm?
Well, I think there are a lot of people in the room who could speak to that. I think when we look at our projects, the built projects, we think of each of them as they're imperfect, but all of them have some kind of victory. A lot of them represent battles, things that in which the conventions of whether it was regulations like traffic engineering, or the market studies, or the way things were financed, mixed-use financing in federal funding for housing, for instance, is still an issue. And so there's a kind of moving target of things that need to be changed to enable better and better building. But I think there's a real list of things that have become part of the parlance. I remember when this is going to be too long, so I won't go there. But the idea that places might be walkable, that people might want to live without a car near transit, would have been just totally out of the question. We would have been, and we were being laughed out of the room in the 80s and even 90s. But this is just so much more part of, I think, cultural acceptance these days. That doesn't mean that there's not a lot to overcome to get it right, or to remake the places that need to be remade. But I think a lot of that has been accomplished, and now it's about the nuances of not only how to make it better, but how to go back to the places that we made wrong and make them right.
One of the tools early on that I recall DPZ using and then became very popular through the CNU was the charrette. And I guess, could you talk to us a little bit about the importance of the charrette as a design tool, why it figured or perhaps continues to figure so centrally to DPZ's methodologies, and why you think it is perhaps an important tool in the toolbox for architects to consider using?
I will, by tying it to your prior question, because part of those victories, or part of the reasons that there has been to some degree a culture change, is that all those organizations exist. And here in Maryland, you have had the Smart Growth, what is it called, the Smart Growth Center?
The National Center for Smart Growth.
Education and research, research and education.
So, and smart growth grew out of the Iwani principles, among other things, which was also a kind of birthplace for the new urbanism. So many groups, the environmentalists, economists, designers, have been working in the same direction. And I think what the charrette did was actually bring them together, to make decisions together, to bring in that information together. So the AIA had RUDETs, right? Which looked at existing conditions in cities, but really bringing everyone at the table to help in making the decisions, or to take ownership for the decisions, I think, was the advantage of the charrette. I should say, at the same time, or its provenance really came from the preservation community, which was standing up to complain about losing buildings. And so that kind of early NIMBY, people complaining about things and advocating to prevent things from happening, caused a group of us to say, we've got to get people on the side. It's more powerful to say this is what we want, instead of saying this is what we don't want after the fact. And so that preservation was very important, the preservation movement, in terms of, I think, spurring that kind of approach. That said, it's really evolved, and it's a different context for public participation these days, and very often the kind of politicization, which now affects the built environment, makes it very difficult to do it in public. And we probably need to evolve that method to be more like, if we look at a place like Australia, where it's more like the jury method, like our judicial organization, in which people are required to participate from a broad background, so that the kind of hijacking of the public process, or the victimization that sometimes comes out in it, can be avoided.
Interesting. Well, speaking about another group of NIMBYs and perhaps folks complaining about things, we'll shift to architectural and urban education. And I want to say before anything else, Liz is this year's recipient of the Topaz Medal, which is a joint award, the highest joint award for an educator made by both the Association of Collegiate Schools of Architecture and the American Institute of Architects. And she's going to be presented that medal at the ACSA conference in Vancouver, about as far away as you can get from Miami. And then I believe there's also a celebration again in Washington, D.C. with the AIA National Conference. So congratulations. So urbanism and architectural education don't necessarily go hand in glove. There is oftentimes with architects an overfixation on the building and a misunderstanding or a lack of understanding of the city, part and parcel of what Karl was always championing us to overcome, was to understand the city as an advocate for building form. At points in time, organizations like the National Architectural Accrediting Board have eliminated both history and urbanism from the language of in-progress scripts for what the conditions for accreditation would look like. And then because of people yelling and screaming at various conferences, those things have come back in. So there's always a tension. History and theory being the intellectual mindset of our profession. Without it, we're merely engineers. And urbanism being the built reality of history. It is the conveyor, the continuity of history. How do we as a profession of faculty and students of architecture play into that role? What could we do better in terms of being better educators and advocates for the city, being more like the Karl Dupuis of this world?
Well, that is the $64,000 question, isn't it, for those of us in the academy? But I must say I don't understand the horror that schools seem to have about teaching history, a chronological history of our profession. That is the definition of the word profession, is it not? That we're learning. It's a body of knowledge that's growing over time, and we're learning from our predecessors. And we seem to have great difficulty doing that in the schools of architecture. Vincent Scully understood that the sequence of ideas and that chronology of cultural change was a very important way of understanding why things were the way they were in design or in cities or in the contemporary work that's going on. There is in spite of ourselves, we build on our predecessors' work and the experience we gain from others. And so I really don't know why we can't acknowledge that and imagine that that's a foundational component of our profession. I was never given a chronological history course in any of my architecture programs. I TA'd for Vincent Scully, and that's how I took this course. It wasn't part of the curriculum.
And it's not part of becoming a registered architect anymore either, so it's kind of frightening. So I'm not a big fan of disruption, but there are two big disruptions I can think of. I'm going to combine two questions that I gave you to think about. One has to do with disruptions caused by technologies and technological processes. The computer obviously has disrupted the practice of architecture, and we've all been navigating that. But oftentimes, these technologies are offered to us as a deus ex machina. For example, autonomous vehicles and smart cars are being touted as the future of urbanism. I've been to South Florida, I've been to Miami Beach, I've seen for 30, 40 years now, autonomous vehicles usually driven by blue hair individuals behind them. On the one hand, there's a question of technology. how does technology play into the new urbanism? How do all the doodads and gizmos that my colleague likes to talk about as being things that are like bells and whistles that immediately distract architects, and they want to like look at those things and planners and whatnot. And then the other extreme of unpredictable disruptions like the COVID-19 pandemic and the way in which it's just caused us to think differently about interior and exterior spaces. How do those disruptions figure into the way the CNU and leaders like yourself are thinking about cities?
Well, you know, it's interesting that you mentioned COVID because looking at history and when we were wondering exactly what COVID would affect, how COVID would affect our professional work, we realized that what brought people to Florida in the first part of the 20th century, and in fact what spurred early modern architecture, was the Spanish flu and people reacting to disease and a different kind of pandemic. And so they're interesting. And so we started to think about how that might affect building design. We had some good stories coming out of the communities that we had worked on, in which people would write us and say, we're stuck at home and we are so glad that we're living here because we know our neighbors. Our shop owners are still willing to have the shop open to feed us, et cetera, et cetera. You know, the sense of community that reacted, in which people reacted to the kind of horror of the pandemic. But the technology question is a really big topic. And I think everybody has very often very passionate thoughts about it, or ideas, stances even. You know, I find myself looking at certain technological advances and saying to myself, just because we can doesn't mean we should. And I think a lot of the issues, like you said, the electrical vehicle, which is a tremendous advancement, and I think even the urbanists will acknowledge that giving everyone an electrical vehicle would reduce emissions faster than we can change urbanism to be all walkable and transit-oriented. So it's a good thing. But we know that it's a technological replacement for behavioral change. And that's the way I teach my adaptation course, is you have two kinds of responses available to us today. One is technology and one is behavior. And actually they can come together also. You can have an electric car and drive less. But the idea, one gets the sense that, especially even with the kind of federal support of electrification for the whole country that's going on now, that's about a technological response. Let's just fix the technology. We're going to get out of trouble with technology. But in fact, there are behavioral responses that could be more effective, producing less of the catch-22 that always seems to come with new technologies that I think deserve much more attention. I had a couple of things I wanted to touch on here. All right, so that's about look out for it, right? You know, don't take it for that it's going to solve everything. But then there are the solutions that really might be, or the responses that really could be very helpful. And how we pick and choose those is, I think, important. So that old environmental adage, think regionally, act locally. Perhaps AI and some of the new things that we're working on these days could make it easier to be local. You know, the move out of the small town, the move out of certain cities, which have been happening for decades and in some cases are still happening. Make those places, but the technology can make those places viable again, whether it is remote work or the kind of dispersion of employment that's taking place in some arenas. I think there's a very hopeful picture in which we can combine these two ideas. And one that comes to mind is, the sealed buildings that supposedly are beneficial for the environment because we don't waste air conditioning or heat. But there's a way to have opening windows and a smart card that you put in the room that closes, will close the window once you take the smart card out or whatever. And so, I think how we combine technology with behavior is really important. It's not just technology.
Excellent.
I'm not getting into technology in academia.
No, we won't do that. We'll avoid that one. And I'm going to wrap two of these together as a final question, and we'll open it up to our audience who obviously want to be part of this discussion as well. The environment and the condition of global climate change is poised probably to hurt underserved areas of our population more than anyone else. It's also poised to pretty much, according to the maps I saw last time I was in South Florida in your office, wipe out virtually everything except for the interstate highway system in South Florida. So be careful about buying real estate down there. And at the same time, the climate, the sort of possibilities for the underserved populations in our country, in our world, dealing with affordable housing seems to be something that periodically CNU has taken up effectively. I can think back to the Hope 6 projects that were authored by people like Amy Weinstein and Cheryl O'Neill. They come to mind, folks from here in the DC area. So what are your current thoughts about how CNU can play into, one, preparing us for catastrophic change with climate, and two, dealing with this perennial issue of how we humanely deal with our fellow citizens and provide opportunities for them to live?
I think they're related. I think they were part of my last slide. Those are the issues before us now, and somebody's going to work on it many more years than I will. But I think in some ways they're very different because the climate issues, first of all, I think that the role of urban design and urbanism is that it addresses very directly behavior and emissions, energy conservation, and the use of resources, of limited resources. And so in that sense, we're on our way. But climate change has two responses. One is working on the cause, which is mitigation, and adaptation, or making places resilient in the face of the impacts that they're going to be facing, like the Florida story that you described. And that one's very local. That's what we were trying to deal with that transect of Dade County, and it's in the built environment, it's in the natural environment. It's exactly what urban designers and architects can provide input on. It may not be one project at a time, but our kind of design thinking should be driving the policies and the solutions. That said, there's going to be some difficult choices being made about how we spend money on that. It's not just spending money on roads, which we've railed against for a long time, but how do you defend places, or how do you help people move out of them? The private sector is responding by saying, you don't have to leave, we'll just buy your land and we'll redevelop it. And at the beginning of a project, there's enough capital that we can remake the place to deal, at least for the life of the mortgage or the investment or depreciation or whatever people are concerned with. So there's a fair amount of that going on. But what about the single family homeowner or the renter in those homes? That's who you're speaking about. And, I think that's about, first of all, a shared commitment to that problem, and this is where the housing question comes in, is there really has to be a commitment to saying everybody deserves, or we believe in our society that everyone should have housing. If they're mentally ill, if they don't have enough money, if they're lazy, it doesn't matter. Everybody should have housing. There are countries that do that. And then I think you give the architects, the designers, a fighting chance to be able to provide it. But, otherwise you're asking the question, what can designers do to influence financial instruments, which are driving the game now? In this trajectory of 30 or 40 years, we've seen all of us working in this arena where we're no longer making places for the market of the user. Places are being made by the market of the investor. And Patrick Condon is one person who's writing about this, about the financialization of real estate and the fact that land value is driving a lot of the lack of affordability, particularly in places where people want to be. So I think a little while ago, Rob Studeville, in his weekly scribe for the New Urbanism, wrote about $30,000 houses in Aurora, New York. So that's the first question of affordable housing. There may not be a housing shortage in terms of sheer numbers, but it's not where people want to be. So that kind of renewed understanding, I think, of that housing picture is critical to our time, because the designers can only work within that larger context of finance and a policy that would promote spending money on housing instead of roads.
So finance, policy, technology, each taken on their own, are potential places where we lose our touch with humanity, which is what we can do as architects. We can build humane spaces, but we don't control that aspect alone. We need to be political entities.
But we can have a strong voice about it.
Absolutely.
And, I think one of the ways that the New Urbanism addresses this in a very different way, but by calling attention to the public realm and to the shared spaces that we share, even if we don't live in the same places, which is frequent in American society or in American urbanism, are of critical importance. And that's something that we can contribute, because once again, it's a kind of like that void that we found in Kentlands, in which we said, nobody really is paying attention to that, right? So paying attention to how are the streets made, how are they designed, how do we make places, those public spaces, accessible, the waterfronts, the parks, how wide are the sidewalks on the streets? Those are small steps in making places inclusive and accessible.
Great. So Liz, how about we ask them if they have any questions, or do we want to just stand up and walk out? No, we want to ask them if they have some questions.
We tried to answer them.
And I'm going to do, as I said before, I'm going to do this Phil Donahue style, so I'll get up and walk back with my mic. You going to walk back? I like being Phil Donahue. He has a full head of gray hair. I'd look good with a lot of gray hair. There's a question over here.
If I may, Liz, thank you for touching on the difficulty of getting projects through and conducting charrettes in a politicized atmosphere. We've experienced that quite a bit. Even when there was a lot of work that laid the groundwork for MXT zoning in advance of our work, but then the pushback from NIMBYs, people who lived in suburban neighborhoods speaking up and really dominating the conversation and pushing that. I'd like to hear a little bit more about the Australian example of the jury model and how that came about and how that's conducted. And have you been involved in charrettes or other processes in your work that use that method and lessons learned?
No, my knowledge of it borders on wishful thinking. I have not had personal experience with it, but I've heard about it, and it would be interesting to research more. But it comes up, I think, when we start saying, how do we change what's going on now that situation's evolved? It needs a new model. So I'm sorry, I can't give you more than that, except to say that, as I understand it, it's people are called to participate or give opinions, respond to surveys based on a broad sample rather than the neighbors. And this has a way of, I think, I'm not sure I'm going to remember all 5 components, but he says there are 5 different types of people who can provide an opinion. And you should make it very clear in a charrette who they might be, so that people understand that there are differences. And one is the immediate surroundings, who most likely don't want something to happen. One is an elected official who's thinking about the whole city and things like revenue and how the sustainability of the place. And then there are interest groups in between those two, and that they should all have a voice very clearly in the public process. So, and in the room together, so that people understand that these things have to be worked out together. It's not that easy, though.
There's a question back here, and then one back.
Hello, thank you for being here. I was just wondering, do you have any thoughts about how access to nature interfaces with new urbanism? I don't know if that's too general, but... No.
Well, I think the introduction of the transect enabled a kind of rational approach of combining nature and built form. I think we always understood, and the environmentalists at the beginning, let's say in the 80s and 90s, everybody was thinking, need to be separate. We need an urban boundary. The animals and the plants are on one side and the people and the buildings are on the other, right? And there were big fights about that. But I think very quickly it became much more nuanced. And when we did that regional plan in the Panhandle, we had a scientist with us who kept pointing out all the animals that lived in the subdivisions that were already there. The wild animals, the natural creatures of nature. And that idea of how these things interface, I think, is very much part of the new urbanism. So the wetlands issue, which is very real in certain parts of Florida, for instance, or the places that are now flooding, inland flooding, riverine flooding, and so on, is an interesting aspect of that, because there is a tendency to draw the line, or to say you shouldn't remake places because they're natural now, so you can't go there. You know, the famous wetland line that you can't get any urbanism out of it because it's, all over the place. And so how we bring those together, it's not just staying away from each other anymore. It's really about saying, how do we make a human ecology a place where people can walk, be connected, live a sustainable life, at the same time that we enable or even make the natural places better by bringing them to some kind of ecological balance. And I think balance is the important word, in which we're balancing the needs of the natural environment and the human one, and imagining how those two can work better together. It sounds hopeful and abstract, but I think it's an evolving picture that's actually very interesting to be part of.
Thank you.
I'm going to bring this microphone up to Karl Elefante, and as I do that, just as a process thing, I remember working on Haymount, and then Haymount, there were creature corridors that were mapped, and there was maybe that same scientist that was there present with us talking about places where there was an eagle's nest and so forth going as part of the whole configuration of the site. So the community started to grow around those as well as the human needs at the same time. Karl Elefante.
Thanks, Brian. Well, first, Liz, thanks for being here tonight, and congratulations on the Topaz Medallion. I know that you actually have to earn that. And I just wanted to start by thanking you for your work and your educational work all these years, that you've always been in touch with the work that you're doing and the teaching that you're doing, building a knowledge of work that helps practice. You've really done the work, and I think that that's extraordinary. And it's really helped me, and I'm sure it's helped a lot of other people in the room, be better architects and do better urbanism. And that you know, never underestimating how important it is, the significance of your work, and that it's contributing to a larger body, I think is a really, really important lesson that you've taught us all. My question for you is that I've spent a lot of my life as a preservation architect, existing buildings, existing communities, and in my office, I like to say there is no such thing as a new building. Buildings are either existing buildings that are being adapted and reborn, or they're infill buildings. They're in a place. They're contributing to things that are already there and in making a future that isn't there. And the new urbanism has sort of two challenges to continue being the new urbanism. One is that it's not new anymore, so the name is a little inappropriate. But the other is in the context of what I was just saying about our work, that I think increasingly it isn't about new urbanism, it's about urbanism that's within a continuum of urbanism. How do you see the sort of the future of new urbanism when it's not new anymore?
Well, you know, I think the Congress is, as a group, is trying to deal with this and saying, how do we deal with problems that are now different than when we started? The challenges that we're identifying now are different than when we were beginning. So thus far, nobody has suggested a name change, but maybe that would be appropriate. But I think it's just, in a sense, the viability of new urbanism as a movement, as a kind of coherent group of people who are pulling in the same direction and understand that there's some power in agreeing on how things should be. Because that was, in fact, part of the initiation of the organization, was to say, we want to be more powerful than just a few individual offices or individuals working on these things. And so we tried to be. We've tried in various places, whether local or even federal, to influence policy that affects cities. So it's really, I think it's about always understanding what's the next problem and how does the values that have been set out, how do they deal with the new problems that we're dealing with? Or maybe they're not new problems, but we haven't been addressing them before, and they're much more evident now. So I don't know if that responds to what you're asking about, but I think there's now a set of, I guess I was, when we did the transect for Dade County, I was in the mode of saying, okay, we've had 20 good years of discovery and testing and individual victories and projects and failures, and now we know a lot. we have a lot of techniques, we have a lot of measures, we have data. We don't have so much data, but we have observations. And so what do the young people do? Do they just have to learn what we know and that's all there is to it? But I know they're not interested. The next generation's not interested in just repeating what we've been doing, right? And I realize that, in fact, they have their own challenges. I mean, I'm still part of the people trying to address them. How do you take the advances that have been made and carry them into the next things that need to be worked on? So, right now, I think the CNU is grappling with trying to understand how equity, bringing our original ideas about mixed income communities, how do we really address that again in the new, and sort of with the new spotlight on equity and wealth building, inclusion, as well as climate change, which can be so localized in terms of addressing it. There is a group of people who are signing, maybe Diru can help me with this, who are signing a document saying, I will never design something that, I think Jeff Speck is doing this. Do you remember what it is? It's kind of putting ourselves on the line about, we'll never do this in our practice.
Kind of Hippocratic oath for architects.
Yeah. Does anyone in the room remember? It's terrible to bring it up. It's like not having the punchline of a joke.
We have time for one final question, and if you want to ask questions after this one, you can do so. We have a reception outside. You can get together with Liz. There's this individual that had their hand up way before you, Professor Hurd. I'm sorry.
Gonna cut it off. I always do.
Thank you, Brian. Liz, thank you so much for this speech that you gave us. Okay, I'll stand up because my mom told me to. But thanks to Brian, your works have been a really good precedent for me for my thesis last year. And I really dove into your work, and I really enjoyed looking at the spaces that you created. One of the things that Andres Duani said in a podcast I remember listening to is creating, having those McMansions, it's really nice, but having those spaces outside and involving the whole community is something otherworldly. It's definitely a lot better than just having it in your home. So yeah, thank you for all the designs you've created. The question that I had is, how do you start to propose change? How do you ask the right questions, and how do you get to the right people to propose change?
How much time do we have left?
Well,
In the beginning.
I have that slide too. I think of the changes that have occurred, and just to use some of what we've been talking about in urban design, the first thing is that people start talking about it. And I always said somebody needs to hear something 5 times before they'll accept it, a new idea. The first time you didn't hear it, second time something's ringing a bell, the third time you're saying, well, I've heard that before. Fourth time you're saying, maybe we should think about this, and you start examining it. And the fifth time, if you've decided it's a good idea, you might say yes, and then you'll think about how to do it. So, people were talking about making traditional places again, and I think when we were starting out, when we were in school, there was no discussion of urbanism, but the Europeans, Leo Krier, Rem Koolhaas, they were the new wave of European architecture in an IAUS tour. They were very much in line with each other at that time, thinking about cities as being part of architecture. And that came to the United States in a lecture tour. And people started talking about placemaking and cities. We should be making cities instead of suburbs. So the first thing is starting to talk about the ideas and having the ideas. The second thing is to make an example. It could be through drawings, or the importance of Seaside was that people could experience it. Never mind that it was a resort, just having several days in which the kids could run around and you could walk into a market and walk to the beach and to a community center and so on, was eye-opening. It then enabled policy changes. There was a very interesting predecessor for smart growth in Florida for many years. It's changing now, as you might imagine. But there were policies at the state level that were encouraging what we were talking about, because they would have their meetings in Seaside, at the Seaside Institute, at the symposiums that were going on there. So that kind of sequence of that first example is really important for people to experience and to judge. And I think if you look back, we had low-flow toilets and water in Florida because of a 1980s concern about drought. And very slowly, it became part of the market in a very similar kind of sequence. So the social scientists actually have parsed that into a series of steps. And so you can try to address it consciously, but it's always slow.
One of the things I think that we were talking about on the way in today as we were driving through Washington, D.C., on the way out here, was the long game of urbanism, that you have to be willing to play that long game and understand that it's not an immediate change, that change happens over a significant period of time. You've devoted your lifetime to that change, and it's been, for you, and for the rest of us, thankfully, it's been a very productive change that we've seen as a consequence of that. But it's not a quick game. It's a game that does take time.
Yeah, and we should end perhaps on a note, if we're that the people who do the heavy lifting are the people who bring those tricky things like finance to bear on making places. And so the developers, who we would prefer to call town founders, who devote a lifetime to one project to make it as good as it can be, and to engage multiple builders and homeowners, who can be a real pain in the neck, to make these places happen they are the real change agents, the people who are risking a lot to make the change.
And there we have it. So Liz, thank you so very much. We very much appreciate it. This has been well worth waiting for, and our conversations in June and July of last year, back and forth, have paid off. I want to thank again the Dupuy family for being here and for all those years lending Karl to us. Karl kept us focused. I want to thank the dean for making sure that we got this thing done. Dawn, this was a hard thing to pull off, particularly after we had to pivot. But there's also somebody in the room I want to thank, and I want to thank somebody that is here today, although she retired yesterday, but she's made today possible for us, and that's Christina Hosa in the back of the room. She started her retirement this morning, but came in to make sure that this event was a success. And so you win the Karl Dupuy Medal for keeping on going. Thank you.